When Paul, George, and Ringo get together in the early part of the 90s to work on Beatles Anthology, they wind up doing a whole lot of things that they used to do when they were the Beatles. They work on songs together, they record those songs, they give interviews, they allow themselves to be filmed and photographed, and they probably do a whole lot of other things too. And it also seems to me that in May of 1995, when Paul, George, and Ringo get together at Abbey Road Studios, it sure looks to me like they sit down for a Beatles press conference. Now, I know it's not the Beatles, I know it's Paul, George, and Ringo, it's the Threetles, and I also know it's not really a press conference. But here they are. Here's Paul, George, and Ringo kind of huddled together on these very uncomfortable looking chairs. They've got a bunch of cameras on them, probably a whole lot of people behind the scenes. Someone's asking them questions, okay? And then it also looks to me like they kind of lock in with one another when they're answering these questions, just like how they used to do when they were the Beatles. And they had to lock in because back then, it was the Beatles against the world. And they had to deal with all these reporters asking all these ridiculous questions. Now, I'm not saying these questions were ridiculous in 1995, but certainly in the 60s, they had to put up with a whole lot of crap. And they had to kind of huddle together and be very jokey and maybe even sometimes a little bit defensive. And I'm not surprised that, here in 1995, they are locked in with one another because, after all, they've been working on Anthology for a few years now. They've just finished working on Freeze a Bird and Real Love. And Paul says it was just like being in the band again. And Ringo says after listening to the songs, he says, it sounds just like the Beatles. And George says that when him and Paul harmonize together, it's very easy for them to lock in with one another. And he kind of laughs and he says, it sounds just like the Beatles. And of course it sounds just like the Beatles. And then Paul even says it was very easy kind of getting back into the groove and making that sound again. Well, you know what, guys? It's easy for you because you are the Beatles. Nobody else can make that sound, just you. So anyway, here we are back at Abbey Road Studios at this little mini Beatles press conference, okay? And there's not a whole lot of footage of it. There's just not. There's only about 5 minutes or so of it in episode 9 of Beatles Anthology. And how do I know there's only about 5 minutes of it? Because what Geeky Jackie did is I took all those segments and I organized it in the sequence that I think that it was filmed. Okay, and why did I do it? Well, why the heck not? Whatever. I just did it, okay? That's because I wanted to do it. And I do think the whole sequence, this whole press conference does begin with Paul and Ringo joking around with one another, being very Beatley, playing their parts, getting ready for the press conference. And the next segment is a very short one where they're settling into those chairs and there's some people kind of hovering around and they're looking at one another almost as if to say, okay, this feels kind of familiar. Is this like a Beatles press conference? And then the next segment is not, I think, that question about Beatles Anthology and would it have been a good idea to make it in 1975? I think the first question that they respond to is one that is probably not even asked, okay? But it is a question that they've probably been asked a lot of times, since 1970. Are the Beatles getting back together again? I think what George does, he gets into Beatle mode and he's just kind of joking around and probably just, sits down and with these guys and with Paul and Ringo and automatically just says, me and Paul, we're getting together and going to do stadiums next year. And then Paul says his line. Paul kind of says, yeah, mud wrestling. And Paul turns to somebody off camera and gives them a wink. And then, of course, Ringo says his line because they're all on the same page. They're playing their parts. They all have their lines to say. And Ringo has the best line there. He says, I'm going to be the ref. It's just perfect. And now comes, I think, that question about Beatles Anthology, a question that more than likely they've never been asked before in all these years. But they're still on exactly the same page. And you can see in their heads, they're all on the same page. They're all going back to 1975, and they all have pretty much the same response. It's like, no, that wouldn't have worked. And like, no, it couldn't have been done. And like, no, we were at war then. So seriously, they're all in agreement that no on 1975. And next are the segments where they're talking about Abbey Road Studios, and Paul talks about them working on their first album and how they got a lot more powerful and were able to make Abbey Road Studios their playground. And like a segment or so later, George kind of says exactly the same thing, but George says that, after they'd had some hits, the engineers were more likely to allow the Beatles to experiment in the studio. So Paul is talking about the Beatles becoming a lot more powerful, and George is talking about the Beatles finally getting some recognition. And this is really a cool segment here where they are talking about and reminiscing about Abbey Road Studios, where because they have the same memories here, and you can kind of see them getting in their Beatle bubble, and they're giving each other some pretty good eye contact, and they're talking about, the engineers giving them some acetates, giving them some tapes to take home with them and listen to what they've been working on all day long, like, please, Mr. Postman. But the other interesting thing about this Abbey Road reminiscing segment is it seems to me that what George and Ringo do is they defer to Paul quite a bit. They throw Paul quite a few lines, maybe to induce him to tell his stories. I'm not sure. But George did it in the very beginning when George says that, yeah, me and Paul, we're going to be playing stadiums next year. And that was Paul's cue to say his line. And it happens again when Paul is talking about working at Abbey Road Studios and how Abbey Road was pretty good for their sound because now they had access to all these different instruments. And George says, you mean all those instruments that are now at your home studio? And Ringo pretty much does the same thing when Ringo turns to Paul and he says, you were the one who would always call us up and get us to come into work at Abbey Road Studios. And this was Paul's cue to tell that story that we've heard a million times, where he's the workhorse of the group. But George, before Paul gets going, George says, "You probably ran out of beauty competitions to judge." So this was another cue for Paul to tell a different kind of story. And Paul does go there, and Paul says, "I did have a lot of beauty competitions to judge that year." But Paul does go back to Ringo's question, Ringo's cue, and you can tell Paul, even in 1995, he's probably, still got a little bit of hurt there, still got a little bit of pain. Maybe he wasn't feeling, even then, was remembering not being super appreciated. I don't know. And he tells that story about John, but I'm sure that everybody by that time in 1995 really appreciated Paul and his work ethic, just like we all appreciate Paul and his work ethic. And next, I think in the next segment, I think in this Beatles press conference is where George tells his story about how the Beatles were in Abbey Road Studios and they just wanted to make a little bit of history, but the engineers, they wanted to leave early. And so the Beatles, they get together and they concoct this plan to induce the engineers to stay as late as possible. So they get Mal to take the engineers this very special pot of tea, and it works. The engineers stay late, and the Beatles, they go ahead and make history. And you know what? I don't know if this has White Album written all over it, and so this is Pirate George. This is this is Cheeky George. This is Beatle George. Telling the story and just kind of being super irreverent. And the other guys, they kind of you can tell they loosen up a little bit. Paul and Ray, they're already kind of loose anyway, somewhat, but they loosen up even more. And they just look like naughty schoolboys right there in that last segment. And the other cool thing about this segment is, whoever put this together, okay, with episode 9, they played some background music to George's story, and the background music that they play, especially as you get into the last segment of the story, is Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Oh my God, it's just fantastic. We're never going to know everything about these guys. As fantastic as Anthology is, I absolutely love it. It's fine, and I don't need to hear everything, but every once in a while, okay, we do get a peek behind the curtain, and it's wonderful. So thank you so much for being here with me today. I really and truly appreciate it. And until next time, peace and love one another. Take care.
Beatles is Beatles are Beatle, 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 Beatle. In the end, it's like, oh, sod off with the Beatles,